Thank you, Mr. Lamborn. Mr. Garamendi is recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Garamendi is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We might add to that question that you just raised, Mr. Lamborn, what is the cost of keeping all of this, and what are the options that may have a higher priority? But that's not my question. We often hear the word multi-domain. One of the things we occasionally hear is that information is a powerful weapon. And the question arises about information for the Russian people about what is actually happening in Ukraine. So my question to both of you is, what is the status of our information efforts to enlighten the Russian people about what their leader is doing to their brothers and sisters in Ukraine? So let's start with Ms. Wolters.
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, information in the hands of the Russian government has been a weapon. It's been a weapon that they've been less successful in deploying to the effect they seek, and that is precisely because, as you point to, the U.S. allies in the global community have ourselves utilized information, which in our case is true information, facts, not disinformation, to set the records straight. And the impact, I'll just say the impact of that information is made clear by the efforts that the Russian government makes to try to prevent that information getting to the Russian people. And they're not completely successful, but it is an ongoing struggle to get that information.
Completely missed my point. What is the Department of Defense doing, and larger, what is the U.S. government doing to bring information to the Russian people? That is, to get information past the censorship that Putin has employed in his country. So specifically, what are you doing?
So we can talk about in greater detail in the session this afternoon. We would defer to that setting.
General Wolters, is the answer the same from you at this hearing?
Sir, I can elaborate more in a closed session, but what I can say is in the military dimension here at U.S. Eucom, we have a large program that targets that very issue in Ukraine and with the nations on the periphery.
Well, I then will await the classified hearing. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Whitman is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank our witnesses for joining us today. General Wolters, I want to expound upon the point that's been made about the timeliness of getting these munitions and supplies to the Ukrainians. And we know that this is particularly important as we are working to get those thousands of Stinger missiles and Javelins to the forces there. There is, I think, sometimes a lack of clarity about how that's being accomplished and what the urgency is with that. But I wanted to get your assessment on the demand signal from Ukraine. Where is that? Is it being met? Is the demand signal going to get greater? And what about from our European allies that are helping send weapons there, and what we're going to do to help backfill some of that? We had an earlier question in those areas. And have you evaluated the potential operational availability of things like man-pads in Ukraine, and look at all the different aspects that are there about what we can do to help Ukraine in many different ways? I argue that the tide is potentially starting to turn in what the Ukrainians are able to do to the Russians. The Russians right now are limited in their maneuver, which is a big advantage for the Ukrainians. The problem is that we're at one of those tipping points that if we really don't go all in to help them, then they won't have a chance to defeat the Russians. I think defeating the Russians, which wasn't on the table, I would say 35 days ago, is on the table now. So give me your perspective on the demand signal and the backfill for our allies and what we have going forward.
Well, Congressman, we actually want to connect the dots for the demand signal and the input.
Yeah.
And with the input process, there are human beings that are involved in that input process and protecting their livelihood is very important. So the mode of delivery, the diversification of those modes of delivery, and obviously the end game is getting the right stuff to the right soldier at the right time. And all those variables have to come into the equation. And I will tell you that with each passing day, we iterate with this with greater thinking, greater alliance involvement, and greater connective tissue with our counterparts inside of Ukraine. And that process has to continue, and it has to be looked at every second of the day, because as the campaign changes over time, what's good for yesterday might not be what's good for tomorrow. So all that has been taken into account. Congressman, it's not perfect, and I hope when you get a chance to come visit us that you'll be able to visit some of the troops that are involved in this process, and they're targeting this very issue.
Fantastic, General Wolters. I look forward to that visit. Dr. Wallander, Stingers are a tremendously capable weapons platform. The challenge is they're a circa 1960s weapons platform. We're using them at an extraordinary rate. So the question then becomes, what are we doing going forward to replenish our short-range air defense systems? Those short-range tactical weapons, incredibly important. But we're going to have a big hole in our inventory. So the question is what can we do to replenish those stockpiles? Is it smart to replenish them with a circa 1960s weapon? Are we doing anything in the long term for short-range air defense systems? So give us your perspective on what we're going to do with that, because that does, while helping Ukraine today, does create a challenge for us in the months and years to come.
Yes, Congressman, you've absolutely identified a challenge that we're grappling with the Department of Defense, and also many of our allies and partners who've generously made contributions to Ukraine are asking questions also about replenishing their stock. The Undersecretary for A&S, Acquisition and Sustainment, is leading an effort in the department to look at the defense industrial base, to look at our authorities, and to look at funding in order to address exactly this challenge. It's just beginning, but I think you'll begin to hear about this because it is something we have to address.
Very good. I mentioned Stingers, that's one part of it, but there are a lot of different moving parts, as General Wolters talked about, in things that are going into theater, parts that are moving around. Give me your perspective on where the future challenges are, not just with Stingers, but other parts of our inventory. And then, are there lessons that we are learning about logistics in this whole effort to be able to supply our friends in Ukraine and help our allies in Europe get resupplied? As General Eisenhower once said, he said, tactics are for amateurs, logistics are for professionals. And we want to make sure we understand the logistics chain on this.
Well, I'll just speak narrowly from a policy perspective. We are doing an assessment of the needs because we're hearing from individual allies and partners about their concerns, and we want to bring a comprehensive assessment to Congress and work with you exactly on thinking forward and not just running after the problem.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Whitman. Ms. Spear is now recognized for 5 minutes. Okay, I think we'll come back to Ms. Spear. Mr. Norcross is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Appreciate it. And fascinating discussion, certainly from our industrial base and the idea of the Stingers, what we are using from our strategic reserves, what other NATO countries are supplying. But incredibly important that we understand that for every Stinger that is leaving our inventory, it keeps us in a more precarious situation. Because as we know, the line is not hot now, and what it's going to take. Certainly agree with Mr. Whitman is, do we want to recreate the old ones or move into new ones? And that's a discussion we're looking forward to. But General Wolters, wanted to talk to you about the invasion. I think by virtually all estimates, that Russia is not doing anywhere near what we expected them to do in Ukraine. When we look at that, did Russia overestimate their ability? Did we look at their capabilities thinking they would do better? Or is it the Ukrainian response? If you could give some clarity on there, have we overestimated what Russia has outside of their nuclear stockpile, their conventional forces?
Congressman, I think we have fair agreement in the hardware, software, and human capacity. I think what we have to take into account is the fact that it's a little bit of both. The will and determination of the Ukrainian citizens. There's 44 million Ukrainians, and every single one of them is contributing. And then you just take a look at the capability of the Russian military, and they're certainly challenged. And as we all know, we all have plans. And when the invasion starts, what you thought was going to happen typically doesn't happen, and you have to go to alternate COAs. And that's a test of the flexibility at the strategic level all the way down to the tactical level of the military. And I contend that Russia has been challenged in that area, and that reflects in their overall performance.
So have we overestimated, and outside of the Ukrainian resistance and what they're doing in the fight, have we overestimated their technical abilities, particularly with their the Russian armor?
We may have, Congressman, and I think once we get to the post-conflict phase, we need to go back to these very areas and make sure that we conduct a comprehensive all-domain after-action review and find out where our miscalculations were in our forecast.
Well, rather, absolutely. I have to agree with that what implications that will mean for our force structure and what we're working on, certainly in the European theater. But thank you for that insight, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Norcross. Mr. Scott is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Doctor in General, thank you for being here. I know we've had a lot of discussion about the Ukraine lately. I think the world owes President Zelensky in Ukraine a great thank you. I fall into the category of Vladimir Putin had no intentions of stopping with the Ukraine. The Russians have been across the border in both Georgia and Moldova for a number of years. Georgia and Moldova have recently officially applied to the European Union for admission. Could the two of you speak to that particular issue and what that means for European security, and if you expect Russia to be more aggressive towards those countries because of that application?
Thank you, Congressman, for highlighting that while even as we're focused on Ukraine, there are other countries in the Euro-Atlantic space that are vulnerable to Russian coercion and influence. Moldova and Georgia have long suffered unresolved conflicts that Russia uses to keep its own corrupt influence inside those countries and to try to prevent their Euro-Atlantic aspirations. But as you note, it hasn't. The people of those countries do continue to hold those aspirations, and their leaderships continue to work on democracy, rule of law, anti-corruption. And the Russian invasion of Ukraine just highlights the importance of sustaining those, the United States sustaining those efforts along with our European allies and partners.
I think it's just important to note that assuming the Ukrainians win and are able to force the Russians out, Russia is still across the border in other countries, and we need to restore the integrity of those territorial boundaries as well before the world believes that this Russian aggression is over. I do think, and I've mentioned this a couple of times, I do think that we as the United States and NATO needs to be developing a Black Sea strategy because of the importance of the trade that comes out of that region for the world. And I don't mean to sound like a broken record, but the raw materials for fertilizer, the amount of wheat and grain that comes out of that part of the world is very concerning to me that transit is shut down. And while the Montrose Agreement guarantees freedom of passage for civilian or commercial vessels during peacetime, my understanding is that is shut down now. Is that correct? That civilian vessels and commercial vessels, because of the conflict, are not transiting in and out, whether it be because of insurance costs or other reasons?
Congressman, to your first point, I couldn't agree more about comprehensive defense with respect to all of the regions in Europe and what we do in the Black Sea and what we do in the Baltics and what we do in the North Sea, we can't just get myopically focused on today with what's taking place with Ukraine and Russia. We have to image our way through the next 5 or 10 years, and we're doing that. With respect to the Black Sea, there is still small travel back and forth with small commercial vessels for the appropriate reasons, but Turkey is the owner of the Montreux Declaration, and I would just characterize what they're doing in this arena as very, very picky with who goes through, and they're doing that for justifiable purposes to make sure that they too can protect against strategic miscalculations. But we need to get back in the Black Sea, and it needs to occur sooner rather than later.
Well, countries like Georgia can't export or import without access to the Black Sea, and I think we need to be paying attention to the other countries as well as Ukraine. One thing I would mention to you, and I think that what has happened in Europe has kind of reinforced this with the committee. Every year, the DoD, I'll pick on the Air Force on this one, comes to us with a list of weapons that they want to stand down. They have, for the last 10 years, come to us and said, we want to stand down a certain number of A-10s. It has long been, I believe, the belief of the majority of the committee that before we stand down a weapon system, that weapon system should be offered to countries that share our interests and our values. General, do you think that the DoD will take a stronger look at sharing those weapon systems with others who share our interests and our values instead of simply standing them down as we push forward?
I think they will, Congressman.
Thank you both. I yield.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. Ms. Spear is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I, too, want to add my congratulations to Paul for his extraordinary service to this committee. It's been a pleasure to work with him. To our two presenters today, thank you for joining us. Part of the conversation today has, I think, underscored the fact that we are united both on the Republican and Democratic side. But there appears to be this interest in wanting to keep poking at the president. And I just want to say once again that the former president wanted to remove 20,000 troops from Germany and was talking about America first as our whole policy. What we recognize now that it's a united front and that NATO's relationship is critical and that we've seen them come together. General Wolters, you referenced yesterday that there probably was a gap in our intelligence gathering relative to Russia's prowess. Do you have any more that you can share with us about that? When I think about the fact that they only spend $69 billion on their military, we spend $740 billion, it seems like we should have recognized that they're not up to the task when it comes to training and maintaining their weapons systems.
Congresswoman Spear, there could be a gap, and I think what we owe our citizens is, once we get into a post-conflict environment, is to go back and examine that very issue to make sure if there is, in fact, a gap, we rectify it. But at this point, I agree with you that there was a degree of miscalculation, and it's evidenced by the performance of the Russian military up to this point, and I think we need to be prepared to take a really good look at it.
Do you think that the light airstrikes that they have actually undertaken has something to do with the fact that they're probably not maintaining their fleet?
I think they're not maintaining their fleet of aircraft to the same level of expertise or excellence that we do in the United States.
Dr. Wallander, we met with Ukrainian members of parliament yesterday. Not only is Russia taking busloads of people hostage to Russia, they've taken evidently 2,000 children who have been orphaned as a result of this war that they engaged in. What are we doing to amplify that internationally, to call them into question and to recognize the parallels to what was going on in World War II?
Congresswoman, we've seen these reports as well, and they are both shocking and very concerning. My understanding is the State Department is tracking reports of these kinds of atrocities and potential violations of international law, and is working with allies and partners globally to track those and to press Russia to cease in the activities and to lay the groundwork for holding Russia accountable in order to reverse what Russia is doing, but also make sure that the world doesn't forget.
Well, I hope that we declassify information that we have in this regard. We have to amplify the gross actions by Russia. Dr. Wallander, we've seen evidence of Russia using the so-called vacuum bomb in Ukraine, which is indiscriminately targets nearby civilians by literally sucking the air out of their lungs. I'm concerned that we draw attention to that you are able to confirm if in fact they're using that. I presume that those would be crossing the line and akin to the use of chemical and biological and tactical nuclear weapons. Can you comment on that?
We clearly see a change in Russian tactics towards more aggressively targeting civilian infrastructure, civilian human life, and indiscriminate use of weapons, artillery, missiles, and I believe you're referring to the TOS 1A. Yes.
But I think we have a responsibility to amplify what we know they're doing that is so heinous. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Spear. Mr. Desjardins is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Wolters, I'm becoming increasingly concerned about what appears to be intel community failures over the past year. We were told that Afghanistan nationals would hold for at least 6 months, and we were told that Ukraine would probably fall in only a few days. I'm not sure we gamed a scenario. The intel community did a great job in predicting the invasion, the amount of troops, the number of tanks, but here we are on day 34 or 35, and I don't think it was gamed beyond the initial 2 to 3 days. In Congress, we rely on these assessments to allocate resources and weapon systems. How concerned are you about what appears to be intel failures, and what do we do to correct those moving forward with looming threats such as China, Taiwan?
Congressman, just to be fair, and I know you know this as a commander, that the world of a 21st century intel officer is very difficult. I often ask our intel professionals, what is so-and-so thinking? And as we all know, a threat is defined as capability and intent, and part of that intent is what one human being is thinking. And given the structure of how Russia operates, it's very difficult to determine where President Putin's head was the entire time. But I think what we owe each other is, once we get the facts about how this unfolded and what was said and what was accomplished, we need to go back and take a look at our soft areas and make sure we fix those. And I agree with you. We've had some tremendous work conducted by the intelligence community. This one has been baffling as a result of Russia's challenges and the spirit of the Ukrainian citizens and their contributions were probably areas that we need to examine one more time to make sure that we're aware of their contributions to the outcome of a campaign.
Yeah, and I'm grateful the way NATO has stepped up and in many ways led after this conflict transpired. Just 3-4 years ago, President Trump was accused of trying to destroy NATO by asking them to meet their GDP assessments. It seemed to be pretty prophetic. And now in the face of the current conflict and threat, these countries are stepping up. You mentioned Germany. It's good to see them do that after essentially free riding the U.S. security guarantees for more than a decade and cozying up to Russia economically. How do we prevent a backslide in the event that this turns out the way we want, and how do we keep our NATO allies on board?
Better communication from senior military leaders like myself to the North Atlantic Council to go back over and over again and describe to them what their contributions when it comes to hardware and software and people are doing with respect to our ability to better defend our NATO turf. And the more we do it, the more we maintain the positive campaign momentum in this area, and the more we figure out how all this contributes to keeping the citizens more safe. It'll keep the countries interested and their level of involvement will continue to increase.
Okay. I've been disappointed in the president's almost schizophrenic messaging before and during this conflict. Initially, sanctions were the deterrence, and now we've learned that sanctions were never meant to deter. He had mentioned here recently that we would respond in kind to a chemical weapons attack, and that you know, the mention of sending MiGs has been brought up several times today, but it apparently was too provocative, but apparently bringing up a regime change was not too provocative. So how is this messaging from the President and the White House affecting your ability to conduct operations on the ground, and what effect is it having on relationship with our allies?
Congressman, I'll just tell you that the alliance unity in NATO is as powerful as I've ever seen it, and my suspicion is that trend is going to continue. So in that arena, no effect.
Okay. And I had one more thing that maybe we can talk about in the classified setting, but I'm pleased to hear of your support for the Sea-launched cruise missile, and I guess I would just ask, if Russia did decide to use nuclear weapons, is it your assessment that they would most likely use the low-yield variety, and what are the limits of fallout and damage from that?
I'd prefer to address that in a separate venue, but what I can tell you is, as a military commander, I have to be prepared for Russia to exercise all options, and that's just one of them.
Okay. We'll look forward to further discussion. Thank you both.
Thank you. Mr. Geiger is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Wallander, thank you for your testimony. I was glad to see you highlighted the Baltic Security Initiative in your written remarks. As you know, this initiative provides targeted defense assistance to Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, our 3 key Baltic allies. Securing an authorization for the Baltic Security Initiative last year was one of my proudest moments in Congress, and I'm pleased that $180 million was included in the omnibus spending package. In your written remarks, you also mentioned the Department is dedicating funding to this initiative each year. Would you share your perspective on the Baltic Security Initiative and how you envision it moving forward?
Thank you, Congressman. Our Baltic allies were among the first and clearest in understanding the challenge that Russia poses not only to their security, but to European security. And they have led, I think it's fair to say, a lot of the thinking in NATO about the requirements for effective deterrence. And the early iterations of the European Reassurance Initiative and all that you mentioned have focused on creating that rotational presence that General Wolters referred to in his opening remarks, and in making sure that those forward presence include not just forces, but the enablers required to make that deterrence effective. And the Baltic countries have done a great job of cooperating with one another through the Baltic Security Initiative in order to make that credibility coherent and sort of greater than the sum of its parts. They are interested in sustaining multi-allied contributions, and I think that the American ability to elevate the importance of NATO allies continuing to support on a multinational basis is something that signals to those countries and their citizens that this is an all-of-alliance effort.
Great. Thank you. Are there any particular areas where you would like to see the United States deepen cooperation with Baltic states? And do you think there's more that we can and should be doing to support our Baltic allies?
Well, I'll mention the focus on sharing and helping build resilience in cybersecurity, which, again, they were leading voices on the importance having experienced themselves. But they are frontline. The Russian government does, and hackers do target Russian-speaking populations in those countries. So I think highlighting the importance of cyber resilience and their best practices and helping the rest of us learn would be something we need to focus on in the next stages as well.
Thank you. General Wolters, I want to ask you about the threat that Russia poses in the gray zone. As I've said before, if we draw any lessons from the ongoing war in Ukraine, it is that we need to ensure our allies and partners are too prickly for any adversary or competitor to swallow. That's why irregular warfare training is so crucial. Recognizing that we are in this unclassified setting, what insights can you share about how Eucom is approaching this challenge? Are there additional steps we should be taking to bolster irregular warfare capabilities throughout Eucom?
Congressman, you should exercise, train, and act in competition as closely mirrored to how you anticipate acting in crisis and conflict. And many of our operations, activities, and investments over the course of the last several years that you're very familiar with in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, have focused on that very issue. And in so doing, taking into account all domains, you'll improve your ability to gain in the deterrence arena with respect to activities in the competition phase. And then if the switch is flipped and we wind up in conflict or crisis, you're in a position to where the muscle memory is correct and you perform better. And that's exactly where we've been since 2016 as we kicked off the EFP battle groups in the Baltics. And each one of those op centers that support those battalion-sized battle groups over time has grown more aware of activities in the gray zone and have become more effective in what we can do with respect to all domain deterrence.
In general, and it's not just limited to the Baltic regions. I think we've seen that irregular warfare is both can serve as a deterrent, but also obviously as a defensive be a great defensive capability for all of our partners in Europe. So just want to kind of emphasize that. Last question: there was Dr. Wallander. You said that switchblades were approved. Have they been sent to Ukraine?
Those are in the package that is in process of being delivered.
And so in the process of being delivered, as in the actual package being delivered, not as in like the theoretical wording of the package.
Yeah, and we can't get into operational details in this session, but we can talk in greater detail in the next session.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Gallagher is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. General Wolters, Commandant Berger has written about future Marine Expeditionary Advanced Bases operating potentially in Eucom that could provide ground and aerial sensing, EW, cyber effects, long-range fires to counter Russia. How would Marines with those capabilities affect your options as a combatant commander?
They dramatically enhance our options, Congressman, and as you know, we have exercised cold response ongoing as we speak, and the Commandant just paid a good visit, and what we're seeing out of TUMEF and what we're seeing out of the mall is doing exactly just what you alluded to. A brown water force that can shoot, move, and communicate and is very, very expeditionary is priceless for 21st century security.
So is this some of the stuff we've heard about, 2nd Marine Division potentially working in cooperation with the 6th Fleet to do ASW operations, sensing operations? Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
All of that is ongoing in all domains, and the guidance as we embrace cold response, it's an exercise that's proceeding as we speak, is to get all of us to stretch our left and right buoys. And you can't succeed if you just occupy one domain and attempt to achieve effects in one domain. So the Marines are doing a fantastic job of leading from the front and showing the rest of us how to do it right, especially in the brown water environment.
So you, as a combatant commander, see a lot of promise in these experimental efforts?
Absolutely.
On a similar note, as the size of our amphibious fleet has diminished over the years, Eucom no longer receives a MEU 365 days a year for a 24/7 active crisis response. If the inventory supported it, would you benefit from having a MEU that was enabled by both tactical aviation and Group 5 UAS that's capable of reconnaissance and counter-reconnaissance and would be on station 365 days a year?
I would, Congressman, but as you well know, as a commander, you never get everything that you want. But certainly those capabilities are precious for effective deterrence.
Thank you. On a different note, in the months leading up to February 24th, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, did you consider it part of your mission to deter a Russian invasion of Ukraine?
Yes.
And what were you doing in order to deter the Russian invasion of Ukraine?
Improving our NATO security disposition in all regions and in all domains, not just isolated on the periphery and inside of Ukraine.
So you as a combatant commander felt you were part of an interagency effort intended to deter Vladimir Putin from invading Ukraine?
That's correct. Deter and dissuade.
Deter and dissuade. And then on February 24th, Vladimir Putin, of course, invaded Ukraine. Correct?
Correct.
Now, you could argue he invaded Crimea in 2014. He had, infiltrated the Donbass before that. But nonetheless, In light of that fact, which is indeed a fact, would it be fair to say that deterrence failed in Ukraine?
Number one, I would say that NATO solidarity remained, and NATO's ability to effectively deter remained, and I can't argue with your conclusion.
So deterrence failed in Ukraine. Specifically, integrated deterrence failed in Ukraine. And I don't bring that up to score a partisan point. I just think it's worth understanding why that happened, particularly as we now have anonymous senior Pentagon officials bragging to the Washington Post about the success of integrated deterrence in Ukraine. Now, it may be true that right now NATO is as unified as it's been in decades. I celebrate that fact. And the fact that Russia has not expanded its war into NATO territory is a good thing. But it is also a low bar for geopolitical success. And the fact remains, as you have just confirmed, that we attempted to deter an invasion of Ukraine largely using non-military instruments of national power, and that attempt failed. Now, it may be true that nothing could have deterred Putin from doing this. We'll never know. That's a counterfactual. But integrated deterrence as conceptualized by the Pentagon and as implemented in the specific case of Ukraine, as a matter of fact, failed. And I yield my second.
Thank you. Mr. Carbajal is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I, too, wanted to extend my thanks to Paul for his many years of service. I've gotten to know him over the years, and he's just a quality, professional individual, and I just hate to see him go, but congratulate him on his next phase in his life. The war in Ukraine is reshaping the future of U.S.-Russia relations. I am very supportive of the steps the United States and the international community have taken to hold Putin and Russia accountable and isolate him and his oligarchs from the global economy. However, one of the areas of mutual interest had been the extension of the New START Treaty to 2026. We must not forget about the potential for arms control agreements to lessen the threat of nuclear conflict. Dr. Wallander, how will the ongoing crisis impact future arms control opportunities with Russia and perhaps even one step further, China?
Congressman, thank you for highlighting the importance of arms control as an instrument of security policy. Arms control can serve national security policy by enforcing and reinforcing constraints and restraints, and especially restraints on dangerous weapons, especially in the nuclear enterprise. Russia has shown no indications that it doesn't value that treaty and continue to comply with it. And the United States will continue to focus on making sure that Russia complies, and we continue to have the arms control dialogue with Russia on that treaty. I can't really speak to Chinese strategic thinking on this, but I think that the message to China is not only that the U.S. values arms control and lives by it, but when Russia has violated arms control treaties, the United States has called it out. So the importance of compliance, I think, is a clear message both to Russia and to China.
Thank you. The department made it clear it did not support Poland's proposal to transfer MiG-29s to the Ukraine military due to existing effectiveness of anti-tank weapons and air defense systems, in addition to the concern Russia could mistake this transfer as escalatory. Countering Russia's air capabilities is critical for not only military operations, but to protect civilians. I am the first to say that we must do everything in our power to not escalate the situation, which is why I have expressed my concern with calls for establishing a NATO-enforced no-fly zone over Ukraine. However, if the MiG-29 proposed transfer was deemed unacceptable due to the risk, and we sadly continue to see civilians being targeted, a question for both witnesses: what can the international community do to bolster Ukrainian capabilities to counter Russia's air power and protect civilians?
So the air defense and anti-air capabilities that Ukraine possesses has been deploying to good effect, and which has been a major focus of U.S. and other country provisions of security assistance, has enabled the Ukrainian forces to prevent Russia from achieving air superiority, from holding back Russian air operations, which not only protects Ukrainian military formations, but as you note, helps to prevent attacks on civilians. It doesn't prevent all of them. General Wolters can speak to that in more detail, but it has played a role.
Thank you. General Wolters.
Congressman, just as you said, we have to continue to iterate as the campaign progresses and make sure that process-wise, for supply and demand to the Ukrainian armed forces, they get what they need for campaign effectiveness. And what they may need tomorrow is different than what it was last week. And if we're not prepared to adjust and iterate to support that, we won't be as effective as we can be to help save lives on Ukrainian territory. And that's a process that we're continuing to work on, and we have to make sure that we maintain a strong dialogue, but we also bear the responsibility to guard against the strategic miscalculation that you alluded to. So we can't rest for 1 second. We've got a lot of work to do out in front of us to make sure that the Ukrainian armed forces are getting the right gear at the right time based off where they are in the campaign.
Thank you. I'm out of time. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Gates is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Wallander, we're not sending the 82nd Airborne into Ukraine, right?
Correct.
And regime change in Russia is not the policy of the United States, is it?
Correct.
And God forbid, if the Russians use chemical weapons, we would not respond by using chemical weapons against the Russian people, right?
Correct.
So why does the president keep speaking out against U.S. policy?
Congressman, the president has made clear that he has not changed U.S. policy on regime change.
No, but why does he speak against it?
That he is appalled by the horrors, as I think we all are,
We're all
of
appalled.
what Russia is wreaking in Ukraine.
But how could it not confuse our allies and our fellow Americans to have the president saying the exact opposite of what you just correctly defined as U.S. policy?
My understanding from allies is that they value U.S. leadership. They are confident in American commitment to the NATO alliance, and in particular, the president's words that the United States will deter Russian attack against NATO and defend every inch of NATO territory.
That's all fascinating, but it doesn't get to the question of speaking directly against our policies. Does the Department of Defense assess that the president is likely going forward to speak against U.S. policy on other matters?
Congressman, I can't speak to that. I don't believe that there's any such assessment.
Maybe do we have a plan in place for the next moment, right? I mean, because this didn't happen once, it didn't happen twice, it happened 3 times on like highly consequential stuff like regime change and chemical weapons and sending our service members into Ukraine. And so I sort of wonder whether or not we have to have contingency plans for a president who seems to be a little confused on those matters. And you're saying there is no such contingency plan?
I'm telling you, Congressman, that the Department of Defense leadership is focused on sustaining and advancing American national security policy of this administration.
Is the Department of Defense leadership frustrated by the president's statements against U.S. policy?
Congressman, I think that is an inappropriate characterization of
But it's
the
not a
Defense
characterization, it's a
Department's
question. I
commitment.
said, is the department leadership frustrated? I'm not characterizing. I'm trying to ascertain how hard this job must be to get our force posture aligned, to get our information operations that Mr. Giramendi asked about in line, when you've got a president who seems to be misaligned on these key questions.
Congressman, I can only speak for myself. I think it's appropriate, and you have the
Were
right
you
to ask the
frustrated?
question. And so, speaking for myself,
I'm sorry, but you can't badger the witness. If you ask a question, you got to give her at least 5 seconds to say something before you then interrupt. Please go ahead.
I am not frustrated. I feel privileged and honored to serve the American people and to serve this president and this administration.
Are you aware of any other officials at the department that are frustrated by the president's misstatements of policy?
I am not.
General Waller, hypersonic weapon systems have been used for the first time in this conflict, and the committee has received a number of briefings regarding how far behind our country is in some of these capabilities. How should Eucom think about hypersonics really from a defensive capability, seeing what we've seen on the battlefield?
Congressman, that's a great question, and it's all about strategic speed and posture. And every day I've got to find a way to adjust our indications and warnings and adjust our command and control and feedback to accommodate not just a Mach 1 target, but a target that can operate at Mach 4.5. And if we're not doing this in 2022, we're getting way behind. So the efforts are there. We find out what the capabilities are. We find out what their locations are. We examine the different courses of action of where these systems can be utilized. And now we have to adjust fire with our IW systems and our ISR to make sure that we have the best probability of capturing a potential strike. And if we're not adjusting every second of the day, we're making a mistake. And it's a constant adjustment in Eucom as well as SACIR.
Speaking of those adjustments, because I only have a moment left, will we see an adjustment in the President's proposed budget or to accommodate our updated thinking about hypersonics now that we've seen them used in Europe?
Congressman, we will.
Very helpful. I yield back.
Mr. Keating is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad my colleagues acknowledging who the President of the United States actually is. I met yesterday with several members of Ukraine's parliament who also emphasized the fact that they're mothers as well. And these courageous women were telling a story that the soldiers, the Russian soldiers that have either been captured or killed, had protective devices and equipment on them to counter chemical warfare or biological weapons as well. And they were concerned, given the fact that also Putin has lied about Ukraine's having access to biological or chemical weapons, and that could be used as a false flag as well for their use. Can you comment in this setting to the best of your ability just to address that issue that they brought up to me?
Congressman, we similarly have noted the efforts on the part of Russian disinformation operations, classic to lay the pretext for a potential false flag about chemical weapons, the lies about Ukraine having biological weapons and chemical weapons. So we've been tracking it closely and share your concern. It would be beyond outrageous for Russia to step over that bound, and we share your concern and focus on that issue.
General Wolters, I don't know, they didn't describe what particular equipment they had, but do you think that their concern is justified?
Congressman, I think the fix in this area is get the truth out at speed so that you can make a difference. And we are dramatically improving our ability to sense what is said and to respond quickest, and in the information domain to arrest the false flags that occur. That's the change that we need to make, and we are making. And I see a higher degree of effectiveness in this campaign than I've witnessed before, and it's just because we've drawn on some pretty severe lessons learned from previous engagements.
Yeah, I have a concern, too, that we talked about strategic miscalculation, but I'm also concerned with public reports about the level of communication between the Russians and our own chair of the Joint Chiefs. These things are in place, even in the worst times of war, for deconfliction and similar kind of miscalculations or that it can occur. Does that seem to be a concern? Is there anything? Is it true, to the extent you can talk in the setting, about the deteriorating level of communication at the highest level of the military, which is always there as a safeguard?
Congressman, I can comment about the SACIR responsibilities that I have to communicate with my counterpart in Russia for the purpose of safety deconfliction. The attempts have been made constantly over the course of the last 90 days. At some point, as we approach closer to the campaign that they initiated without us knowing, those conversations broke off. And I won't speak for the chairman, but I know he's done the same, and he's been very, very aggressive with respect to seeking that conversation with his counterpart for the purpose of safety deconfliction. And unfortunately, those conversations haven't occurred.
That's distressing. Dr. Wallander, on sanctions, You know, we talked a lot about sanctions in this war and their effectiveness with the Ukraine, you know, withstanding so much themselves on the ground. Nothing compares to what they're doing. But these sanctions we're all giving, our European allies are, you know, taking some of the pain. We are as well. But the sanctions are doing more than just affecting the economy. I think they have a strategic effect on Russia's military capability as well, things like semiconductors, chips, and everything. Can you talk to the effectiveness of some of the sanctions on what they're doing to Russia's military capability?
So, Congressman, you rightly point to not just the financial sanctions, but the restrictions on technology. Those restrictions will have an effect over time. And my understanding from the sanctions package that was chosen is that it was designed both to have the effect over time and to target precisely Russia's future capabilities so that its ability to launch these kinds of military operations against its neighbors is severely impacted.
Okay. Well, thank you both for your service. I'd like to thank Paul for his service, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Bacon is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for you both being here. Appreciate your leadership. And I was with General Wolters, some of his recently retired peers last night, and they were singing your praises. So thank you for what you're doing in NATO. My main feedback to the administration since like December, January, and February is that we were being told, yes, Russia has decided to attack. And a lot of the emphasis is what we're going to do after the invasion. I always felt like we should have been putting more emphasis on the deterrence side of that. Excuse me. I recommended long-range air defenses. I recommended anti-shipping missiles. But I was told that that would be provocative. And I think that put us behind the 8 ball once the invasion occurred. And now the Ukrainians are asking for MiG-21s, Su-25s, and we're resisting that. And we're saying that we need to do long-range air defenses instead. Now, I do agree that long-range air defenses have been very effective against the Russian Air Force, but it doesn't do much for the convoys, the tanks, and we got to be able to provide the Ukrainians the ability to hit those 5,000 or so armored vehicles. And so that brings me to my question, the Switchblade. I think it's a very capable system, but 100 is not enough. Would you agree that if they got thousands of these vehicles, we got to have to increase that ability to go after these convoys, these tanks, the armored vehicles? So that would be my question to General Wolters.
Congressman, I'm convinced that when we get the first set of Switchblades in, there'll be an immediate request from the Ukrainians for more. So no argument here.
It seems imperative that we give them the ability to hit these convoys and trucks 20, 30, 40 miles back. You know, the Javelins are more in the close-in fight, and I think that they could have a tipping point impact. My next question involves the F-35 to General Wolters again. How important is the F-35 delivery to you and NATO, whether it's U.S. or to allies?
It's critical, Congressman, and we can talk more in a classified setting, and I know you're familiar with a lot of this, but the U.S. F-35As, the 4 that we have right now, are in use, and they've been very effective doing some elegant ISR activities, and it just reveals to us how much greater capability we're going to have once we get our full fleet on board. And as you well know, the disposition of the NATO nations with respect to the F-35 is dramatically growing, and our hope is we have 100 on the continent right now, and we anticipate in 2030 growing to 550, and that's a good fleet.
I'm concerned that the president's budget, for at least the American buy, it's being reduced. And we're going to have to figure out how to do nuclear modernization plus provide these kind of capabilities. I know it's hard to balance all that, but I think there's a real cost if we do reduce our F-35 buy. My third point is more of a comment. I'm on the Baltic Security Caucus co-chair with my colleague Ruben Gallego, and they do say their #1 request is permanent U.S. presence. And I know you've heard that before. I just want to also footstop that. Now also there's a request for air defense capabilities to the Baltics and the MLRS. And I just wanted to make that for the record there. My final question really deals with Russian energy and its impact on our bases in Europe. Ramstein, Spangdahlem, the new hospital rely on Russian gas. I think that's unacceptable. How do we build this resilience into the U.S. bases so we're not dependent on Russian gas? And that question to either one of you.
Congressman, I'll take a shot at that first. As you will know, the Central European pipeline goes to certain nations. We'll continue to work ways to try to expand that to the max extent practical. And Europe itself gets 40% of their natural gas from Russia. We in DOD, as you also will know, over the course of the last decade and a half, have worked on stock reserve with respect to petrol and stock reserve with respect to generators, and in critical infrastructures like the new hospital and the current hospital, those have to be available so that we can appropriately sustain. And that's very expensive and a tough way to do business, but we have to continue to look at ways to take that Central European pipeline and get it out to as many folks as possible.
I've been preaching this concern now for about 3 years, because if Russia turns off their energy and Ramstein's so pivotal to what we're doing, it doesn't just make sense. So we got to come up with a better resilience plan. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back, and I thank you both for your leadership.